Hey everyone, Tactics here with part 2 of my guide series going over the hardest bosses in Season 4 of Dragonflight, where in this video we've got 5 new bosses recommended both in the comments of that first video as well as by players on my stream or over in my Discord channel. If you're interested in seeing that first video, which goes over Chargath, the Raging Tempest, Kokia Blazehoof, Kyrakka, Leymor, and Umbrelskul, I'll link it down in the description below. And I did actually want to start out this video by talking a little bit on Leymor, just a quick note here, because there is an actually interesting tactic that we've seen some new tanks starting to use now to help mitigate some of the very heavy tank damage on this fight. And that is actually related to the frontal ability that comes out, the erupting fissure here. So what you can actually see when this fissure goes out in a few seconds, what a lot of tanks are actually starting to do now, depending on your spec of course, is actually running out of this effect. Now, this effect looks absolutely massive, but it's actually not as big as it seems. So if you're a monk, you can double roll out of this effect this way, straight back, because of course it does follow you, and you'll be able to get out of it. Similarly, I believe leaps, so demon hunters can leap, warriors can leap as well to get out of it. Potentially a paladin steed will also be able to make it out of this in time, but it's not as long as it looks essentially. So that is one additional tip combined with everything we did in the first video as well for this boss, specifically for tank players. If you're playing one of those specs, DK is probably not going to be able to get out of this unless maybe you use like a warlock gate or something like that, or a life grip from max range. Druids, maybe if you do some shenanigans with like human form, wild charge, if you have a ranged DPS standing like way back here, might be able to do it, but otherwise going to be a bit problematic for them for sure. But just something for some tanks to be aware of. Now let's get into the new bosses here, where we've got Hackclaw's Warband. Now, there's been questions about what boss you should be focusing here. I think generally Trick Totem is going to be the best thing for most groups to focus, and that is because a lot of the things that are going to kill you in this boss fight are related to Trick Totem, right? It's these bolts going through when maybe Gash Frenzy is also going out, maybe when Mark for Butcheries are also going out, or maybe you just get picked like 2 or 3 times back to back to back with these Earth Bolts. And I know pug groups don't tend to have the greatest track record when it comes to interrupting spells, especially spam cast spells like this. So my recommendation is to just get Trick Totem out of the way ASAP. Gashtooth does the most overall damage, but a lot of his things are predictable, first off, and also can be easily healed through or just defensive, right? If you have those, and again, because they're predictable, it's much easier to set up healing for it or save defensives for it, whereas the bolts are a little bit less predictable because they're random targeted, and especially in a pug group, you don't know what's going to get kicked and what isn't, right? So I recommend focusing Trick Totem to preserve kicks on Trick Totem as well. You can also not kick the Healing Rapids cast, especially if you have a Purge in your group. The Healing Rapids cast does not really scale well with key level. I think it does like 400k healing on the initial tick, which, like, look, they have over 50 million health, right? So it's not really a ton of healing. So it's not a big deal if that cast goes through. If you have a Purge, I think it is worth purging the effect off. It's like a 15-second hot on them, so that you probably don't want to leave on them. So if you have a Purge, great. If not, you probably should kick it. The other thing, I am playing a prop paladin in this video, so this boss is not as scary because I get so many of the kicks on this boss. But if you're playing literally any other tank, it is a bit scarier, so that's why maybe in this video it doesn't look like it's Trick Totem's too dangerous, but in general, trust me, Trick Totem's definitely dangerous. Outside of that, you can see here we're trying our best to group the mobs, so we're moving together to kind of kite the Blade Storm towards us a little bit, so you can still get a little bit of cleave on this boss, keeping kicks on Trick Totem, and then just generally, you see I'm always kind of facing the mobs when we're actually taking all 3 of them towards this wall, because of course, Hackclaw does have that frontal constantly going off, so you don't want to melee your group. The other things with a combo, Decayed Senses, is the magic debuff on the tank. So if you have a DPS priest or a warlock in your group, you can actually cleanse that off your tank without needing to actually kill the totem, which just makes the DPS check easier. You don't have to do the DPS check at all. Otherwise, though, you need to make sure you are killing the totem ASAP so the healer can actually dispel the tank here before the Savage Charge finishes. And I mean, on a week like Storming too, beware, because it's very easy to get Storming out of the Savage Charge here, which would not be good. So just keep that in mind. In terms of how I recommend defensiving Gashtooth, so you see here, there's the Gash Frenzy. It's really only scary in combination with the Earth Bolts, like I mentioned. Like individually, it's not too scary. It is also technically a bleed, so if you have bleed cleanses like Dwarf or Evokers, you can clear some of that, the dot on people, but also it clears if you heal them above 90% health. So healers, make sure you are dumping healing into players for this to clear that dot. Outside of that, the Marked for Butchery is actually the big damage hit that only goes on one player. So if you get targeted by this, you either want a defensive, or you can also actually combat drop it. Boom, like that. Actually, here, that's a perfect example. Any combat drop, vanish, feign death, as you're about to see, shadow meld, actually completely mitigates this damage from Marked for Butchery. Targets our hunter, he feigns, Marked for Butchery ends it. And so that's another big way for you to mitigate Gash Tooth's damage entirely. So that's kind of why, again, I recommend focusing Trick Totem in general over Gash Tooth. So hopefully that helps you guys. Let's now move over to Algeth'ar Academy and take a look at the Overgrown Ancient. This is a boss fight which initially, to set up immediately, you need poison dispels. 100% you need poison dispels unless you have absolutely insane slows and lockdown and AoE stuns and stuff. So one poison dispel, technically all you need. Two is still very good. You get a lot of value from that second poison spell even, but it's not mandatory. One for sure is, and that's for the ads and the intermission, which I'll get to in a second here. But first let's talk Germinate. So you can see here, the best way to group these mobs up from the Germinate is to have everyone be stacked. And then you're going to see us rotate around in one direction. So we kind of ping the direction we're going to be rotating in here. And as long as you just be consistent with that, if your group is always going to be rotating counterclockwise, just always do that. Always clockwise, always do that. Obviously, storming this week makes it a little weird, but we didn't get interrupted there. So just being consistent. And, you know, you're just passively cleaving down the odd sets. These sets don't really matter in terms of pumping them with damage, because the boss won't spawn all these ads again until after every even set. So every second set, that's when the boss does burst forth. So that's when it's important to have damage. These ones don't need to be nuked down. They're not a priority. These ancient branch mobs, though, are a priority. Obviously, the healing touch, just keep that interrupted. But the big thing is this 1 minute long bleed that goes on the entire party. It can get quite nasty, especially on higher key levels. So you want to make sure that you are killing this branch ASAP and getting into the healing absorb it provides. Now, cleansing that bleed is very important for tanks in particular. As you're going to see here, I think I cheat shortly after this. The biggest damage moments of the fight are when Barkbreaker, overlaps with literally any other ability. So with the bleed, you're taking, you know, I believe it's a fizz damage amp, so you're taking the damage from the boss and you're taking the damage from the bleed. That's a lot of damage. It's also scary when it overlaps with shortly after the burst forth, when you're tanking all the lashers, so you get the debuff. Got a lot of lashers. I greed here slightly defensively when I probably should have pressed something, and you're going to see me cheat here. So you want to make sure you have some coverage. So that's about every other bark breaker, I believe, or maybe it's 2 bark breakers in a row. So it's 30 seconds here before this next scary bark breaker. So those are the things you really want to make sure you have defensive coverage on here. So you take a big hit there from, I guess, just not parrying. It is what it is. I cheat. It's not a big deal, because that's what it's there for. And then we're moving into this even Germinate cast. This is a second Germinate cast, and now he's going to immediately get them up. And you can see this is where I'm committing my defensives, my Dev to actually get aggro, give me meta, and then you see my stat count going up and up and up here, and then I get poison dispelled surely the poison, there it is. But like usually if you had 2 poison dispels, you could certainly dispel at, like, you know, 12 13 stacks and get it down, and then you could use a second one when the neck goes up to 12 13 stacks again. You could keep rotating that way. But with just one poison spell, you definitely have to wait a little bit higher than that, just to make sure you're able to not get overwhelmed by the time that your single dispel comes back again. You could also do things like kite if things are living too long, so keep that in mind. And again, priority here is for sure AoEing down those ads when they're actually up, right? You don't want these ads from the second Germinate to be alive for too long, as it can really hurt your tank, especially, like I said, like 15 seconds after this, or sorry, not 10 seconds after the burst forth actually goes off is when the bark breaker happens. So like these ads are still alive. And again, I'm in meta because I saved meta specifically for this. And for Demon Hunters, as an example, you can have Feldev for this every time. Paladins, you can, you know, have a couple CDs for this every time as well, just to help with it. I'm sure every tank spec can. And that's what you really want to do. Commit something to deal with the overlap with the bark breaker and the bleed, but you want to commit a decent chunk for when it overlaps with the actual ad spawn itself on the even ad sets. But that is the tree man. Let's move forward here to Chrono-Lord Deios. Back on the Paladin for this one. The big thing about this is that there is a wombo combo on this boss fight, which happens almost immediately on pull. And I've seen a lot of people just get instantly murdered by this boss fight. It's a combination of the magic dot with the wing buffet ability. That's the big scary wombo combo of this boss fight. So whenever it does happen, they don't always line up, but when it does, you want to make sure you are defensiving it, and it always lines up on pull. You're going to see here, right? The dots are about to go out. boom, they go out, and then the boss immediately wing buffets. So having some defensive for when this happens is pretty good. Even if it's just a group defensive, a small group defensive like mass barrier, that can also be super useful as well. And other thing to note with these magic dots, you notice here 2 of them we cleared like insta. Which obviously seems weird because it's a magic dot, and the reason for that is that it's also a snare. So any kind of movement freeing effects can also dispel your own thing, like freedom. You can spell another person's thing with freedom as an example, but any other things that you would use to like break entangling, for example, can also be used to remove that dot entirely. And so it's very, very valuable to have specs that can do that. You don't even need the priest master spell, which is down a 2-minute cooldown. You just need specs that can have a snare removal, like the shamans and the mage. I believe all of them have snare removals, so they're just able to break their own dot with no issues whatsoever, and that is a lot of damage mitigation because it is a dot at the same time, right? It's a slow and a dot, and it's very, very scary if you have to eat the full duration of that dot or have the dot over the course of a wing buffet cast like it happens on pull, right? So whatever you can do to clear those, it is very, very valuable. Otherwise, moving towards the wing buffet damage specifically, that damage can actually be LOS'd. You're not going to see us LOS it on this boss fight, but it was a very popular strategy back in Season 2 on high Uldaman keys. You would use these pillars at the room here, the front of the room, like by my mouse basically, and you can actually LOS behind the pillars. So generally, like ranged would be playing, at the beginning of the room, middle of the room, and for baiting these orbs, which is important to note, the orbs are player baited, so you don't want to put them too far in front of you or in a spot you're trying to LOS. And then whenever wing buffets would be coming out that you didn't have a defensive for, you would go and you would hide behind these pillars right here to LOS the actual hit. So you basically alternate between using a defensive on a wing buffet and LOSing the damage entirely. And again, you would just be rotating around the room here slowly, just because of how these orb spawns work. And you see how we have it relatively clustered here. And then as we're losing space on this side, I'm going to move across to the other side and continue rotating. And you're going to see near the end of the fight, the ones at the front are going to start to despawn and I'll have more room. So assuming you're able to do like the first rewind time in that first corner, the second rewind time in that corner, one in this corner, one in that corner, just rotate around, 1 rewind time per corner, they should be starting to despawn as you get back to the initial starting place. So you should be able to technically do this fight indefinitely, though it can be a bit sketchy if you start, cutting yourself off with how you're baiting some of these sand puddles. For tanks, the sand breath is actually a pretty scary tank buster, and it happens quite frequently. So this is another fight where you really want to make sure that you have a defensive plan for every single sand breath. Do your best to just survive it, basically, because it comes every about like just over 15 seconds is how often it comes, right? And you have a little bit of a break during that rewind time flow, but otherwise it's like every 15 to 20 seconds, right? It's a bit spooky for sure, and it's a very high tank damage fight in general, especially on higher Tyrant weeks. So you just want some coverage. Do not overdo it too much. Again, the scariest overlaps don't really happen for a tank because you can't be targeted with the time sink, the magic dot, and also there's usually a bit of a gap between the breast and the wing buffet, so you don't really need to be personaling those as a tank player. So you want to save those for the sand breaths, and even like having one small thing up, right? As a paladin here, like having Ardent up on its own is usually enough. Like here is literally just Ardent up, I'm good. You don't need to stack CDs on something like this until you get to very, very high keys. So don't overdo it on your defensives here. Otherwise, you're going to be running out of them by the end of the boss fight. All right, that is it for this dungeon. Now we're moving into Nokhud, where we're going to be covering a couple of the bosses here. The first is Teera and Maruuk. Now, these bosses have a shared health pool here. So as a tank, you are going to be wanting to group them together just to maximize cleave, but also to reduce the damage amp, because as they're further apart, they'll gain a stacking damage amp, and you don't want to do that. The other thing too, the white circle for the leaps here, which you're going to see, this doesn't do any damage. The question I get a lot, this circle, you can just chill in it. Hit this one. No damage from this circle whatsoever. It doesn't do anything. It just indicates where Teera is jumping. So you are fine to stand still if the circle appears on you. And tanks, you are fine to pre-move into the circle, and you will want to pre-move just to help make Maruuk group up quickly with Teera whenever she actually does jump. Now, the scary thing on this fight is, again, an overlap here, similar, I guess, to both Deios and to Warband, where it's an overlap of a spam cast with a big ability. So the big thing is Teera just throughout the fight is spamming quick shot on players, right? This random target If you get picked like 2-3 times in a row, that's when it can get very, very scary. But also, if you get picked either before or after this Gale Arrow, it can also be very scary. That's the Wombo combo. So if you rewind here, you can see she's spamming quick shot, and she will spam quick shot up until the Gale Arrow cast. So boom, and now she casts a Gale Arrow. So that person went down to 50% just before the Gale Arrow, and then they need to get topped. Then this Gale Arrow detonates, boom, it hits everyone, and then she shoots again right there, right? So that's where we want to keep in mind. Those are the people in danger, the person that gets quick shot just before a Gale Arrow, and the person that gets quick shot just after a Gale Arrow, on top of anyone who just gets picked by quick shot like 2 or 3 times in a row. That's what you're worried about here. And so generally, a good rule of thumb is to always defensive the Gale Arrow and look at the quick shot before the Gale Arrow. If you are targeted by that, defensive early just to make sure it covers that quick shot and the Gale Arrow. And otherwise, if you just defensive the actual Gale Arrow hit, your defensive should persist through the quick shot hit that follows Gale Arrow. So either or, both of those work, and that's probably what you want to do. These Gale Arrow hits happen, as you see here, about every 50 seconds is when the hits actually happen. 55 seconds, I think, is the exact timer because of the cast time. So that's when you'd want defensives to cover. So technically, if you have a 1 minute defensive CD, you can pop it a little bit early as well, and it should be able to be usable for a lot of Gale Arrows in a row. But in general, as long as you have some sort of defensive, doesn't even need to be a personal. If you have a group defensive like Mass Barrier, like I said, or even Disc Barrier, because another thing you can do for these Gale Arrows to make them easier to dodge tornadoes is you can stack, like we've done here. So if you rewind a little bit, so you see all our range are stacked. Gale Arrow is a pure single target damage ability. It does not cleave in any way, and the tornadoes shoot out from the players. So if you are stacked up, you won't get hit by your friend's tornadoes here. So our range there stack up, and our melee are stacked up as well. Boom, the tornadoes spawn. And you can see now it's a little bit easier to dodge if you only have 1 stack. We did 2 stacks here because we have a melee and a ranged. So that's something you can do as well. Just be careful that your melee stack isn't too close to your range stack. Otherwise, your tornadoes can hit each other, as you see, like where you have to move a little bit here. But we had enough time. If our range stack was like here, for example, and our melee stack was here, that would not be good. You would not have time to avoid the tornadoes. But because our range stack is down here, it's fine. But generally, just having as few stacks as possible is better because it keeps all the tornadoes centered in one spot. And like if all of you are stacked in one spot, none of you need to move for tornadoes until they actually start to come back. So it just heavily reduces the overall amount of movement required in the fight as well. So it's very, very good the more you can be stacked. But again, not a big deal if you have a range stack and a melee stack. That's perfectly fine as well. The only other thing that's pretty minor is, I guess, Earth Splitter for everyone who's not a tank. This is, again, can be baited. It's on random players. So if you like line up or something like that, you can kind of bait these lines into a decent spot to not have it be too much of a nuisance. I think we do a terrible job on this first one, if I remember correctly. We're a bit spread out and just goes on random players. Like, this is not super ideal. And then goes again. So you don't have a ton of space here to cleave, but it's not the end of the world. And note there, yeah, the puddles do really hurt. You want to avoid these puddles at all costs. If the AoE goes out and you're like, oh, I'll just cross this puddle to get to a safe spot, don't do that. That's very, very bad. That will probably still kill you. So just keep that in mind. When it comes to tanks here, Brutalize is actually quite scary. So you want to make sure you are popping a defensive specifically on this one, because I believe it goes Brutalize, Gale Arrow, Brutalize. So you get 2 Brutalizes here. She does it before the Gale Arrow even. So on the same time when Teera is using her ultimate, you will take 2 Brutalizes from Maruuk. So try and have a defensive coverage for both of them. 1 defensive for both of them if you can. Again, it's kind of similar to Deios, where this Brutalize ability happens fairly often, so you just want enough coverage. You don't want to overly stack coverage on it, because there's not a ton of other tank damage on this boss fight. And specifically for the ones with the Gale Arrow, usually 1 defensive, if you cast it late enough on that first Brutalize, can cover the second one as well. And also, you don't take any Brutalizes when it's time for Maruuk to do his Earth Splitter ultimate. So something to keep in mind in terms of how to spread out your defensives. Now, let's move on to the final boss of today, and that is the final boss in Nokhud, Balakar Khan. Now, the number one thing for anyone who played in Season 1, you remember your best friend, this rock right here. It's on the southern side of the boss room, as you can see, and basically it is very, very good for mitigating some of the abilities. So basically in Phase 1, the Iron Spear gets thrown. If you're on the other side of this rock, the spear will get thrown at you, but then the boss will charge into the rock, and he won't actually be able to hit you, so you don't need to move after getting hit by the spear. And then same thing in P2, everyone gets gripped behind the rock from the spear, And then no one needs to move because Balakar Karn will just hit the rock and you'll be safe from the charge because the rock stops his movement. Now, in terms of P1 stuff, it's actually pretty not scary for most people besides the tank specifically. The tanks are actually in a bit of danger here, and that is because the main combo here is Rending Strike into the actual, I can't remember what the physical hit is. It's another hit. It's basically a 2-hit combo, and this first hit is a bit bigger, very slightly bigger than the second hit, but it also applies a very nasty bleed to you. And so what your goal here is to pop a defensive just before this hit goes out. So just before you get that first bleed, that's when you want to pop a defensive as a tank. And you want that defensive to persist through the duration of this bleed ideally, but most importantly to persist through the actual Savage, there it is, Savage Strike, which happens like 4 seconds, 5 seconds into bleed. So 4 or 5 seconds after the initial hit, you'll get the second hit. If you don't have a bleed cleanse, or if you do have a bleed cleanse, it can be very valuable. That can basically be an effective major defensive on the second hit specifically, but you still need something for the first hit. But you can make that second hit way smaller if you have an Evoker Bleed Cleanse or if you dwarf. Either will make the second hit super small, but that first hit is still very big and scary. So keep in mind you want coverage for every single one of those and for it to last as long as possible. Other than that, I mean, here you can see the spear thing in action, right? He's throwing a spear, boom, gets knocked back, doesn't need to move because it hits the rock and immediately stops. Beware though, the boss's hitbox is a little big. It's much bigger than it seems, so don't be too close to the boss when he does his charge here. Just kind of back up and you'll be fine. I probably played a little bit close there, but I'm a tank too. I won't die from it, so just be aware of the hitbox there. Let's move to the intermission. Perfect timing. So basically, for this intermission, if you don't have a Vengeance Demon Hunter, which kind of just souls the intermission, what you're going to want to do is probably assign kicks to each of these ads initially, just as a first kick to group them up. So we are kicking here. I think we also have like a knockback for this side, but that's not mandatory. As long as you just have enough, kick on each one to bring them in initially, it should be good. You can group them up in the middle here. They're going to become active in a few seconds. Boom. We get kicks. There are the kicks, the first kicks, one to each. And then you're going to see, this is where we're going to start to group them up and use AoE stop. So I have Divine Toll, we have stuns, knockups, those kind of things. And we're just chaining our CCs here and trying to kill these as fast as possible. The taking damage is pretty heavy here. So I do recommend bloodlusting this intermission phase if you have it available. I think it makes it a lot safer. Helps the healer throughput, obviously, because you're taking this constant ticking damage, and there is movement in this phase as well. And it helps you to kill these Stormcaster ads before you run out of CC chains or interrupts or whatnot, before you let anything potentially go through. Because one of these casts going through, when someone's like 60% health even, can just spell death, right? Like they're just dead for sure, and it can be hard to recover from that. So, chaining CCs here as best you can. And again, you can always try and type up an order. There's the cap totem coming out. I think maybe a second cap totem. Yeah, the cap totem, the double cap totem. And then from here, just individual stuns, even individual kicks, just to get us through that phase. And because of Lust, we were able to get through that phase very quickly. Also maybe beneficial, depending on what time in the fight you actually start to get to that phase, to maybe save a cooldown for it, an offensive cooldown, and of course, defensive cooldowns potentially as well, can be very useful to get through it. But usually, if we found we like to save the defensive cooldowns as we could for this phase instead of there, and so that's why we used Lust there, because the healing throughput would be enough with Lust to actually keep people top since it was ticking damage, whereas in this phase you're dealing with a lot more one-shotty stuff. So the biggest thing I've seen, I think I've had like 4 or 5 people ask me about this, is the static spear. And it's a thing people were confused about a lot in season 1 as well. So static spear will always hit the target twice. And that is because there's 2 damage instances that are both called static spear. One is this actual hit right here. This hit itself will only hit this player. But then once the spear connects, it then deals an additional hit to all 5 players and pulls them in. So whoever is targeted is in the most danger. They need to be topped, and probably this is the best defensive of the fight here. If you are targeted by static spear, use a defensive. Also, combat drops work here. So feign death, vanish, shadow meld. You can shadow meld this spear hit, and you mitigate not only all the damage on you, but the pull in and the charge as well. It's a huge value shadow meld or combat drop on this boss specifically. So if you have that, use that. Otherwise, use a personal, because the person with the spear is in danger. Everyone else is fine. It's just specifically the person with this spear is going to be taking a lot of extra damage. Like look how low he dropped, right? Boom. And everyone else didn't drop a ton, but the person with the spear almost died. So keep that in mind. They are going to be taking a ton more damage. The other thing to be aware of is the crackling upheaval here also deals significantly more damage in this phase because you're taking an additional hit from dropping those puddles on the ground, right? So one, you want to make sure you're dropping these puddles in a decent spot, ideally not blocking your rock here. So you can see here we kind of move all around. This will just drop the puddles in a pretty decent spot so we can still use this rock for additional spears later on in the phase. But again, this is going to be a big damage hit. So if you are not topped for this hit specifically, you need to use a health potion to be topped, and also potentially group defensives, like I mentioned, are very, very good here, just to reduce the damage, right? Things like, you know, mass barrier, like I said, for mages, I mentioned a lot of times now, just any general defensive here on your group can be very, very good here because it deals a ton of damage. Like boom, like our Revoker, for example, dropped pretty low there from that. So it's pretty scary, that hit specifically as well, and it can get into one-shot territory very quickly, especially as you get into the higher tyrannical keys like 10, 11, 12 early on in the season when you don't have a ton of stamina. So beware of that. The spear is for sure still the most dangerous individual hit here, but if you are not topped and that frontal starts channeling, you want to press a button for sure because it's very, very dangerous. Just in general, for tanks, the combo in this phase is actually a bit easier. So it's this conductive strike into another strike I can't remember the name of, but basically this puts a magic dot on you now. So again, you want to make sure you have something up for this initial hit because that's the scariest, but now you basically never take an empowered second hit because that magic dot should just be insta-dispelled. So this thunder strike is never super scary. You see my health barely moved there, but it moved a decent amount for that first hit, so something to keep in mind. And again, there's another example, how low everyone drops from the stomp. It's very dangerous. It can get into one-shot territory pretty quick, so keep that in mind. But yeah, tanks, just make sure you have a defensive for that first strike, and that's really all it cares about, which means sometimes you get to have the strike overlap, right? I had Sentinel, and it kind of overlapped for a couple ones, so that's nice. So keep that in mind. Thunderstrike, again, not very scary, but there we have it, guys. Hopefully this video helps you down some of the more dangerous bosses, and if it did, be sure to subscribe for more content like it, including advanced route walkthroughs if you're looking to push higher keys for all 8 Season 4 dungeons, as well as similar guide videos moving forward into the War Within. Otherwise, I need to give a big thank you to all of my amazing Patreon supporters for making this content possible, and I'll see everyone in the next video.